The last time I wore a uniform with an NPS arrowhead on it was October 14th, 2019. I handed in my radio and my backcountry permit book and my laminated bear canister waiver cards, and I walked out of the Hoh Rain Forest Visitor Center for the last time as an employee. 26 years. I gave that park 26 years of my life, and it gave me something back that I have carried in silence ever since. I am going to tell you what that is. But before I do, let me know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments below, and if you have had an encounter of your own, say so. I want to know I am not alone in this. My name is Lena Marsh. I am 52 years old. I live in Sequim, on the dry side of the Olympic Peninsula, which is a specific kind of joke if you have ever spent time in the Hoh. The Hoh averages 140 inches of rain a year. Sequim gets 17. I moved there after I retired, and some mornings I sit on the porch with my coffee and I watch the sun come up over the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and I think, I picked a town made of light on purpose. After what I spent 26 years walking through, I needed something dry and open and bright. That is not a metaphor. I am being literal. I needed to see in every direction. Let me give you the setup, because none of the rest of this lands without it. I started as a seasonal interpretive ranger at the Hoh in the summer of 1993. I was 26, 2 years out of Western Washington University, with a degree in environmental science, living in a converted sheep barn outside of Forks that belonged to a friend of a friend. The pay was insulting, and I did not care at all. The Hoh Rain Forest is one of 4 temperate rainforests in the world. It is old growth, big-leaf maple draped in club moss, Sitka spruce with trunks 6 feet wide and canopies 150 feet up, nurse logs that take 200 years to fully decay, feeding hemlock seedlings in straight rows the whole time they rot. Elk that move through in herds so large you can smell them before you hear them. The Hoh River coming down brown and cold off the blue glacier, cutting through the valley with the sound of constant, steady work. I had never seen anything like it. I grew up in Tacoma. Parks to me meant mowed grass and a parking lot. The Hoh was something else entirely. The place had a weight to it, not threatening exactly, more like being in the presence of something that had been at its business for a very long time and was entirely uninterested in your opinion of it. I went from seasonal to permanent in 1996. By 2001, I had my backcountry patrol assignment. The deep park is what most people never see. Past the end of the Hoh River Trail, which runs 18 miles to Glacier Meadows at the foot of Mount Olympus, up into the Hoh drainage above 5,000 feet, where the rainforest transitions to subalpine meadow, and then the permanent snowfields feeding the glacier. That country gets maybe a few hundred permitted visitors in a good summer. On a backcountry patrol in October, you can go 3 or 4 days without seeing another soul. My patrol territory covered the upper Hoh corridor and 3 side drainages off the south face of the Bailey Range. I knew that ground the way you know the layout of your own house in the dark. Every trail junction, every creek crossing, every stretch of the blowdown from the 1999 windstorm that never fully got cleared. The patrol cabin at mile 14, a corrugated metal box with a propane stove and a wood sleeping platform and a radio that worked maybe 60% of the time, depending on cloud cover and which direction the antenna was pointing. I spent a lot of nights in that cabin alone, listening to the river and the rain. That is the baseline. That is who I was and where I was when the first thing happened. 2003, first week of October. I was doing my standard fall patrol, 3 nights in the backcountry, and I had come up the main trail to the patrol cabin the day before, set up, and was going to spend my second day doing the side loop up into the high Hoh Basin. The basin is about 4 miles off the main trail, up a rough, unmaintained route the park maintains on paper but does not actively clear. It is rough going, alder brush, a creek crossing with no bridge, a scramble section through a boulder field at about 4,800 feet before you come out into the meadow. I went up on a clear morning, which is rare enough in October, that I remember the specific quality of the light. Cold, sharp, the kind of light that does not argue with you. I got to the meadow by about 10 in the morning and ate my lunch sitting on a rock by the tarn at the upper end of the basin. There were elk tracks everywhere in the soft ground around the tarn edge, fresh from the morning. An elk had stood in the shallows on the west side, and the hoof prints were still sharp. I ate my crackers and my peanut butter and my apple, and I sat there looking at the glacier above the head wall, and I felt that particular kind of quiet that backcountry rangers develop over years of being alone in big country. It is not absence of sound. There's always sound up there. Wind, water, the creak of the ice above the head wall, ptarmigan moving in the heather. The quiet I am talking about is internal, a settling that happens in your nervous system when you have been in wild country long enough that your body stops running threat assessments on every noise and starts just listening. I was in that state. Settled, not asleep, listening. That is when I noticed the smell. If you have spent time in backcountry, you know animal smells. Elk musk, which is thick and grassy and strong. Bear scat, which is fruity and fermented from the berries. Pica, which I am told you cannot smell, but I have always thought they smell faintly like cut grass and wet rock. None of those. This was different in a way I am still struggling to put correctly into language. The closest I can get is damp fur, the way a dog smells when it has been running in rain, but underneath that, something else. Something with an animal depth to it. Not rotten, not dead. More like the smell you get when you press your hand into the duff under a big tree and feel the heat of the decomposition happening an inch below the surface. A living heat. Something in the process of being itself. I held still. The smell intensified for about 20 seconds, then leveled off. I was sitting with my back to the boulder, facing the tarn, and I became aware of a change on my left side. Not movement, not sound, a change in the quality of the air, a displacement, like when someone sits down beside you on a bench. I did not turn. I want to be specific about that. I did not make a sudden motion. I had been in the field long enough that when your instincts say be still, you are still. I sat for what I estimate was about a minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes, with my lunch in my hands and my eyes on the tarn, while I figured out what was happening on my left side without looking directly at it. What I eventually looked at, slowly, moving my eyes first and then turning my head by degrees the way you do when you do not want to startle something, was this. 30 feet to my left, at the edge of the boulder field where the rocks gave way to meadow grass, something was standing. I want to be careful about how I describe it, because I know how descriptions like this can start to sound like a script someone wrote in advance. I'm going to tell you what I saw and the order in which I processed it, which is how witness memory actually works. You do not get the whole picture at once. You get fragments. The first thing I processed was height. It was tall. My boulder was at about shoulder height for me sitting on it, and the thing standing beside the boulder field was considerably taller than me standing. I am 5'7". This was a significant amount of taller. The second thing was posture, upright, fully upright, not the knuckle-walking angle of a bear on its hind legs, not the forward lean that apes do when they bipedal, fully erect, the way a person stands. The third thing was the build, wide shoulders, wide in a way that read wrong compared to a person, too wide relative to the hip, a top heaviness that did not match human proportion, long arms, not freakishly long, but longer than they should be. The hands, and I could see the hands because they were hanging at the sides, were large, very large.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby, so if you want to check it out, links down below. And let's get you back to the video.
The fourth thing was the hair. Dark. Not black. More a very deep brown, the color of wet alder bark. Long enough that I could not see where the skin ended, and the hair began on the arms and shoulders. Shaggy in the way wild animals are shaggy in autumn, when the coat has come in for winter. The face I am going to give you last, because it is the part that changed everything, and I need you to understand what I saw in the right sequence, or you will not believe the order in which I processed it. The face was partially in shadow from the angle of the light and the overhang of a boulder above. What I could see clearly was this: a broad brow ridge, eyes set deep, cheekbones prominent, a nose flatter than a human nose, wider, a mouth closed, and the eyes were looking at me, not at the landscape, not scanning, at me, specifically and deliberately, in the way another person looks at you when they are deciding something. I'm not going to tell you what I felt in that moment, because whatever I tell you is going to be inadequate. And I have spent a lot of years learning not to reach for words that overstate the thing. I will tell you what I did, which is this. I put my crackers down on the rock beside me. I set them down carefully, not dropping them, not making a sudden motion. And I waited. For a long time, maybe 3 minutes, nothing happened. We looked at each other. The wind moved the heather grass. A ptarmigan called from somewhere up the slope behind me and was quiet again. Then it moved, not toward me, not away from me. It turned, very slowly, and walked along the boulder field edge in the direction of the alder thicket at the upper left of the basin, walking on 2 legs, upright, with a stride that covered ground faster than the gait suggested, not running, just walking, moving with the unhurried deliberateness of something that was going somewhere it knew how to get to. It did not look back. In about 15 seconds it was in the alders, and I could not see it. I sat on that boulder for 30 minutes. I was not incapacitated by fear. I want to be clear about that. I was very intensely focused. I was running through every alternative explanation my training and experience gave me, the way you are supposed to when you observe something anomalous in the field. Black bear on hind legs. No, the proportions were wrong, and bears do not walk upright for any sustained distance with that gait. Human? No, at that height and build, no. Trick of light and distance. I could not make that work. I had been 30 feet from it. The light had been clear. I walked back to the patrol cabin and wrote 4 pages in my field notebook. I have that notebook. It is in my desk in Sequim right now, in the bottom drawer under a stack of elk survey maps. I have looked at it many times in the years since. The writing is small and careful, and what strikes me every time is the complete absence of dramatic language. Observation notes, dimensions, time, smell, duration of contact. The kind of notes you write when you are trying to get everything down while it is still accurate. I did not report it. I want to explain why, because this is the part people always push back on, and the explanation is simple. I had no evidence. I had my field notebook. I had a smell and a sighting and an emotional certainty that I had seen something real. Evidence in a professional context means something physical or recorded. I had neither, and I had a career I cared about. 26 years of building credibility in a park service that takes its science seriously. A ranger who reports a Bigfoot sighting is a ranger who stops getting taken seriously for everything else. So I wrote it down, and I kept going. For 3 years, nothing. I patrolled the upper Hoh every fall and every spring, and whatever I had seen in the high Hoh Basin in October of 2003 did not repeat. I went up to that basin 3 more times, at different seasons, and each time It was an empty basin with a tarn and elk tracks and ptarmigan. I started to wonder if I had been more fatigued than I realized. 3 days alone in the backcountry, early October, cold and clear, a particular quality of silence. The brain can do things in those conditions. Then 2006 happened. I want to skip forward a bit here and give you the quick version of the next several years, because the story that matters, the conversation, that came later. But you need to know the pattern before you understand the meaning. September 2006. I was doing an overnight patrol to the Blue Glacier overlook and back. Coming back down through the river valley in the early morning, about a quarter mile from the main trail junction, I found a structure. I need you to picture where this was. Old growth. Sitka spruce averaging 4 to 5 feet in diameter, canopy up about 130 feet, river noise to the east, trail to my north. The structure was in a hollow between two root masses, where a spruce had blown down maybe 80 years before, and the depression it left was still there, chest deep, maybe 20 feet across. In that hollow, arranged in a way that no windstorm ever arranged anything, were branches, not broken, not scattered, placed. They ran in parallel rows across the hollow, with one large log, maybe 10 inches in diameter and about 12 feet long, as a ridgepole. The smaller branches crossed over it and then crossed back, interlocked, creating a latticework. Not a shelter exactly, more like the frame of one. The kind of thing you would build as a first step before adding weight or covering. I photographed it. I measured it. I noted the height of the ridgepole off the ground, 4 feet at the center. I noted that the ends of the branches had not been cut. They had been broken, snapped, with a clean lateral break, the way you get when you apply force sideways to a live branch. I noted that several of the cross branches were western hemlock, and several were red alder, and they had not come from the same parent tree. They had been gathered. In my 15 years of backcountry patrol at that point, I had never seen anything like this. I had seen bear play. Bears sometimes drag branches around, especially young ones. This was different. The organization was different. The intention visible in the pattern was different. I photographed it from 6 angles, measured the ridgepole, noted the species of wood used, and wrote 3 pages in my field notebook. I did not report it formally. I filed the photos on my personal hard drive, labeled by date and location, and I kept going. April 2008. I found tracks in the snowpack at the upper edge of the Hoh drainage, above the tree line on the south-facing slope below the Bailey Range. The snow was old, consolidated, maybe 2 feet deep with a hard crust from a freeze-thaw cycle. The tracks crossed the slope at a traverse angle heading northeast, and they were bipedal. 2 feet. I measured the nearest one that had a clean impression, 16.5 inches long, 7.25 inches wide at the widest point. The depth of impression in the hard crust was about 4 inches, which tells you something about the weight bearing down. I have seen a lot of tracks: elk, bear, mountain lion, human. A large human foot in a size 14 boot in 2-foot consolidated snowpack with a hard crust will leave a print about 1.5 inches deep. 4 inches means a lot more weight. The stride, measured between the centers of consecutive prints, was 59 inches. Human average walking stride is about 30 inches. An elk's is about 45. I followed the track line for about a quarter mile until the slope angle increased and the risk to myself was not worth the evidence. The tracks continued northeast over the shoulder of the ridge and out of my sight. I photographed 12 prints, measured 4, and noted the direction and the estimated age. Fresh from that morning, the freeze had not rounded the edges. The point at which I became certain I was dealing with a pattern rather than isolated anomalous events was October 2009, and the specific thing that made me certain was not a visual sighting or a track or a structure. It was a vocalization. I was in the patrol cabin on night 2 of a fall patrol. The time was around 11 at night. I had been reading and I had turned the lantern down, and I was in that early stage of almost asleep where you are still aware of the sounds outside. Rain on the metal roof. The river noise below, always there, a constant underpresence in everything you do in the Hoh. The creak of the spruce near the cabin when the wind moved. I heard something that was not those things. I'm going to try to be as accurate as I can about what a sound like this actually sounds like, because the word I want to use is vocalization, and that word flattens it in a way that does not serve you. This was a sound in the lower register of what I can hear, meaning it was not a high call. It was deep, more a resonance than a note. I could feel it in my sternum the way you feel a bass note through a wall. It had shape to it, a rising mid-tone, and then a longer declining tail, and then silence, and then it repeated. Not immediately. Maybe 20 seconds between repetitions. It went on for about 4 minutes. Then it stopped. I know the sound catalog of the Olympic backcountry. Barred owls, elk bugles, Pacific tree frogs, coyotes. Wolf had not yet recolonized the Olympics by 2009. This was not any of those. I wrote it down in my field notebook. I wrote not a bird, not elk, not coyote. Lower register than any of those with intentional shaping, rising, declining structure that repeated consistently. Duration 4 minutes, started around 23 other than 10 hours. The next morning I went out at first light and walked a perimeter around the cabin. On the north side, in a patch of soft ground between 2 root masses, I found 3 prints. Bipedal. The same dimension range as the April 2008 tracks. They were pointing toward the cabin. They had been made during the night. The rain had softened the edges, but the prints were there. Something had been standing 20 feet from the north wall of the cabin, in the dark, making that sound. Now, here is where I want to pause for a moment. Not a dramatic pause, an honest one. I'm telling you this in sequence because the sequence matters. Each event built on the one before. If I had heard that vocalization in 2003 without the October sighting first, I might have logged it as unusual and moved on. If I had found the tracks in 2008 without the structure in 2006, same thing. But by 2009 I had a close-range visual sighting, a constructed wood structure with evidence of intentional gathering, tracks in consolidated snowpack with dimensions inconsistent with any known species in the park, and now a vocalization in the dark with tracks in the morning, confirming the source had been there. That is a pattern. Patterns have meaning. I also want to tell you something about what 6 years of this did to my relationship with that backcountry. I was not more afraid. I was more attentive. What I developed over those 6 years was an expansion of attention. I started noticing things I had been too trained out to notice before. The specific kind of quiet that falls over a section of forest before an elk herd moves through. The way certain birds, particularly stellars, jays, and ravens, respond differently to different kinds of presence in the forest around them. The Hoh is full of stellars, jays, and ravens. A backcountry ranger who pays attention to what the corvids are doing is a ranger who gets information before the information becomes obvious. I started paying attention to them differently after 2006 in certain sections of the upper Hoh, particularly the stretch of old growth between miles 12 and 15. The jays and ravens did not produce the typical disturbance calls I associated with large animal presence. They produced something different, a shorter, lower chatter. Not their alarm call and not their standard contact call. The sections of trail where I heard that call most consistently were the sections where, in subsequent passes, I would find evidence of presence, stick structures, track sets. In the fall of 2011, a line of carefully placed stones along the south edge of the trail at mile 13. 11 stones, fist-sized, spaced about 8 inches apart, Something had put them there. I photographed the stones and walked past them and said nothing. I want to tell you about 3 things that happened between 2010 and 2012, because I skimmed over those years and they deserve more than that. The fall of 2010. I was on a standard patrol, day 2, doing the mile 13 stretch in the early morning. There was a freshly killed elk about 40 yards off the east side of the trail. Not unusual in itself. Elk die from all the normal causes, predation and disease and winter stress and falls on steep ground. What was unusual was the condition of the carcass. Mountain lions cache their kills, covering them with debris. Bears eat from the soft tissue first and leave a characteristic pattern. Wolves take the hindquarters and work methodically. This elk had been opened from the ventral side, cleanly, and a significant portion of the internal organs had been removed. Not scattered, removed. There was no sign of a drag, no cached remains anywhere in the vicinity. Whatever had taken the organs had done so and left no trail to wherever it took them. I photographed the carcass. A young bull, 3 to 4 years old, in decent body condition, no prior illness or injury. The method of opening did not match any predator sign I had seen in 15 years of patrol. No secondary scavenging evidence, no raven or jay activity, despite both being common on the trail that morning. I wrote 6 paragraphs in my field notebook about that elk. Then I walked on. Whatever had taken the organs had taken what it needed and gone. A pattern that does not belong to bears or mountain lions or wolves. The spring of 2011. The morning after I found the stone line at mile 13, I came back through the same section. The stones were gone, every one of them. The trail surface showed the faint indentations where they had been resting. The stones themselves were gone, not scattered to either side, gone. Something had retrieved them, something had come back to that section of trail and collected the stones it had placed, either because I had not responded in a way that indicated I had understood them, or because the message had been seen, and they were no longer needed. I stood on that section of trail, looking at the 11 small depressions in the soft ground. Evidence that something had been there, and then evidence that something had returned. The fall of 2012. This is the one that shook me the most in those middle years, before the 2013 contact, because it was the closest I ever felt to something I did not have language for. I was doing the mile 15 stretch at dusk, later than I should have been on that section of trail, and I was moving fast to make the cabin before full dark. The trail at mile 15 runs along the upper edge of a blowdown from the 1999 windstorm, a wide swath of fallen timber that has been coming back in alder and vine maple. Dense, chest-high in places, the trail elevated above it on a natural bench. I heard something moving in the blowdown below and to my left. Not the random crashing of a startled deer or elk. Deliberate movement, bipedal, keeping pace with me about 30 yards to my left and below the trail level. I could hear the footfalls clearly. Heavy. Even. The cadence was wrong for a large quadruped, and wrong for a human. That particular stride length that I had been hearing about in my field notebooks for years, without yet hearing it in person. I kept walking at my original pace. The movement in the blowdown kept pace with me, exactly for about 200 yards. Then it stopped. I kept walking to the cabin. That night, lying on the sleeping platform in the dark, I felt something that was not exactly fear, but was adjacent to it. Not because I thought I was in danger, because the precision of it felt intentional. It knew I was there, and it chose to walk alongside me, at exactly my speed, for 200 yards, and then chose to stop. That is a choice. By this point, I had a system, field notebook entries, dated and precise, with measurements and GPS waypoints where I could get a signal, which in that country was unpredictable. A folder on my home computer with photos organized by year and type, labeled observation, structure, track, acoustic. A growing body of evidence I had shared with exactly no one. I was not hiding the evidence out of self-protection, though that was part of it. I was keeping it quiet because I did not yet know what I was looking at. A ranger who has been in the field for 15 years knows the appropriate response to something you do not yet understand is continued, patient observation, not announcement. You gather, you document, you keep your mouth shut, and you keep looking. Every patrol, I was looking. And then in October of 2013, what I had been looking at looked back and did something I was not prepared for. I was on my fall patrol, day 3. I had come back up to the patrol cabin from a day loop into the upper basin. It was about 4 in the afternoon. The light was the low amber of early October at that latitude, going golden fast. I had maybe 2 hours of good light left. I was sitting on the step of the patrol cabin, boots off, eating a granola bar and writing in my field notebook, when I became aware of the smell again. The same smell from 2003, the damp fur and deep living heat smell that I had not forgotten. I stayed still. I put my pen down on the step beside me, and I put my hands in my lap, and I waited. The smell grew stronger. Whatever was producing it was closer than the 2003 sighting, and it was uphill from me, to the northwest, in the old growth above the cabin. Then there was a sound, not the vocalization I had heard in 2009. Something different, closer to speech in its structure. A series of sounds with starts and stops and something that I can only describe as the texture of intention. Not random, not mechanical, something that was organized the way language is organized, whether or not it was language. And then, in the middle of it, a word. I'm going to be careful here. I'm not going to tell you it spoke English in a full sentence because it did not. I'm going to tell you what I heard. What I heard was my name. Not a close approximation, not the rough shape of a 2-syllable word that I could have heard as my name, because I was primed to hear it. My name. Lena. Spoken in a voice that was wrong in its qualities, deeper than any human voice, with the vowels slightly elongated and the consonants slightly blunted, the way you get when a structure that was not built for those sounds is making them anyway. But the word was my name. I had worn my name tag every day for 17 years at that point. The trail register at the trailhead had my name on every entry I had ever signed. The permit ledger at the cabin had my name on every patrol I had ever done. Something in those woods knew that the word on all those documents corresponded to me. I put my granola bar down on the step. I stood up, slowly. I looked up the slope into the old growth. I saw it between 2 spruce trunks, about 60 feet up the slope, standing, watching. The same shape I had seen in the Hoh Basin in 2003, 10 years earlier. The same proportions, the same deep brown hair, the same quality of stillness. I said my name back. I said Lena out loud, standing in front of the patrol cabin in the October afternoon light, like I was confirming something. And it answered, not my name, back to me. A longer series of sounds, with the same texture I had heard before, that same quality of organized intention, and embedded in it, one more word I could make out. It was halting, the way any word sounds when the mouth making it is not the mouth it was designed for. The word was stay. Just that. Stay. I stayed. I stood on that step and I did not move. The shape in the trees held its position for what was probably another 2 minutes. Then it moved away up the slope, the same unhurried, deliberate gait I had seen in 2003, and in a few seconds, the trees were between us, and I was alone. I went inside. I made tea on the propane stove. I sat on the sleeping platform with the mug, and I looked at the wall for a while. I was not in a state I know how to describe efficiently. Not fear, not elation, something more complicated than either of those. The feeling of a pattern completing itself, maybe. The feeling of a decade of patient observation arriving at a thing it had been building toward. And the feeling, which I kept examining from different angles and kept finding to be true, that I had been told to stay, not threatened, not warned away, told to remain where I was. I stayed in the cabin that night. The next morning there were tracks outside the cabin door, 3 of them, in a small patch of soft ground just below the step where I had been sitting. They were pointing at the door. The middle track, the clearest one, showed the detail of the mid-tarsal break in the foot, that extra joint in the arch that human feet do not have. It was as clear as if someone had pressed a cast mold into the ground. I photographed it from 6 angles. I took a scale shot with my measuring tape. Then I made my breakfast and packed my pack, and walked out to the trailhead where my truck was waiting in the gravel lot. I drove back to Forks, and I sat in the truck in the parking lot of the smokehouse restaurant for a long time. Before I went in and ate a burger and called my sister. I did not tell my sister what had happened. I talked about the patrol, the weather, how the bears had been moving this fall. Then I went home, to my apartment, and I sat in my kitchen and I thought for a long time. I want to stay here for a moment, in that apartment in Forks in October of 2013, because I think the interior of that experience matters. I sat at the kitchen table and I thought about what had happened in the upper Hoh that afternoon, and I thought about the shape of my life in that apartment, and I had a feeling I have not felt very often, which is the feeling of 2 things that cannot both be true, being simultaneously true. The thing that could not be true, a large, intelligent, bipedal entity living in the upper Hoh drainage had learned my name over 17 years of observation and spoken it to me, followed by an instruction that I had understood. The thing that was also true, I had been sitting on that cabin step when it happened. The smell had been real. The voice had been real. The tracks in the morning had been real, with the mid-tarsal break visible in the clearest one, an anatomical feature I had read about in the track guides and recognized on sight. What happens, sitting alone at a kitchen table at 10 at night in a small apartment in Forks, Washington, is that you pick up your phone and you dial your sister in Olympia, and you listen to her voice say hello, and you say hello back, and then you talk about the weather for 15 minutes, because there is no sentence in any language you have learned, scientific or otherwise, that begins where you need it to begin. I did not tell my sister, not then, and not for 6 years after that. I have not told her yet. She would believe me, I think. My sister is not a dismissive person, but believing me would mean worrying about me, and worrying about me would mean calls every week asking if I was being careful out there. And careful out there has a meaning in that context that I did not want to spend energy managing. So I put the phone down, and I sat at the kitchen table and I thought about what to do with what I knew. What I knew was considerable by that point, and I want you to understand that the 2013 exchange, as significant as it was, did not exist in a vacuum. It existed at the end of 10 years of accumulated evidence. The sighting in 2003, the structure in 2006, the tracks in 2008, the vocalization in 2009, the corvid behavior across multiple seasons, the stone line in 2011, the pacing in the blowdown in 2012, the exchange of stones beginning in 2014, which I was about to undertake. All of that was already in the notebooks. The 2013 event did not create the certainty. It confirmed it. What the 2013 event changed was the question. Before that afternoon, the question was, what is this? After that afternoon, the question was, what do I do about it? I spent a long time with that second question. Here is what I thought. An entity that had been present in the upper Hoh for at least 10 years, possibly much longer given the consistency of its behavior and the obvious comfort it showed in the space, had learned my name. It had spoken it to me. It had spoken a second word to me that I had understood as an instruction. The instruction was benign. Stay, do not leave, not go away, stay. What was I supposed to be staying for? I did not know then. But what came next was not one conversation. It was many. Fragmented, slow, conducted in a language I only ever partially learned, built up over autumn and spring seasons, across 6 more years of backcountry patrol. Over those 6 years, an entity, or several entities, taught me something. And what they taught me terrified me in a way that the initial sightings never did. Not because it was supernatural, because it was not. The terror was in how ordinary and direct and factual the warning was, and in how long ago it was already true when they gave it to me. I want to come back to 2013 for a moment before I move forward, because there are details of that October that I need to anchor properly before this gets complicated. The patrol I was on ended the following day, the 4th. I walked out on a clear morning, 18 miles of trail from the upper cabin to the trailhead. On that walk, I paid attention in a different way than I had in 17 years of walking that trail. Not because I was afraid something was watching me, though something possibly was. Because I was thinking about what I knew and what I did not know. What I knew. A large bipedal entity had been present in the upper Hoh drainage for at least 10 years of my observation. Visual sightings twice. Track sets in 3 locations. 1 structure. 1 vocalization event. 1 direct vocal exchange in which the entity had demonstrated knowledge of my name and the ability to produce 2 English words. What I did not know, how many individuals, how long they had been there, what stay meant. I spent that winter going through every piece of documentation I had accumulated, looking for the shape of it. What I found was that the locations of all the events, mapped, clustered in a roughly 3-mile corridor between miles 12 and 15, with the patrol cabin at the center. The cabin had been built in 1974. Before that, there had been a trapper's line cabin on roughly the same site going back to the early 1900s. People had been camping and sheltering at that location for over a century. Something knew where people stayed. Something had learned the rhythm of human use of that space over a very long time. The spring of 2014, I came back up for the standard spring patrol. April, which in the Hoh means mud and the first skunk cabbage in the lower wetlands, and the elk beginning to come up from the valley floor. I had, over the winter, made a decision. If the contact from 2013 was real, and I believed it was, then the entity that had made it was capable of more communication than it had offered. The question was how to invite more. The behavior over 10 years had been consistently non-threatening. An approach, followed by withdrawal, a presence, made known, then removed. The 2013 event had broken from that pattern, but only barely. What works with non-human primates and what I thought about that winter is consistency and non-threat and reciprocation. You show up at the same place and the same time and do the same thing, and eventually, the thing you are hoping to communicate with decides you are predictable enough to approach. I was already showing up at the same place. I had been for years. The thing I could add was intentionality in the behavior. Instead of arriving at the cabin and going about my patrol work, I would do one thing each morning that was clearly non-functional, clearly a form of communication. I would put something outside the cabin, something with no utility value, something that could only be there because I put it there. The first morning of the April 2014 patrol, I put a flat piece of schist I had carried up from the river on the step of the cabin. Then I went to work. That evening, when I came back from the day loop, the stone was gone. Wind. An animal. A hiker who walked past, though the chance of a hiker on that section of trail in early April was close to 0. I noted the absence in my field notebook and did not conclude anything beyond the fact of it. The next morning I put a different stone on the step, smaller, darker, with a visible quartz vein running through it. That stone was also gone when I returned. The third morning, the 4th day of the 4-day patrol, I put the stone out again at first light, and then I stayed. I had coffee from the propane stove and I sat in the cabin doorway, door open, and I waited. 40 minutes. The forest does what it does. Birds, river. The low creaking of the old spruce, the smell was there before I heard anything, and then from the upper slope, Movement, slow, deliberate. It stopped at the edge of the forest, at the tree line above the cabin clearing, 60 feet, roughly, standing, looking. I held still in the doorway with my coffee. It was there for about 6 minutes. Then it stepped back into the trees. As it went, it dropped something. I heard it. A soft impact in the duff at the forest edge. I waited another 20 minutes, then walked up to the tree line. In the duff, at the base of the spruce that marked the upper edge of the clearing, was a stone. About the size of my first stone, river-worn and smooth, a medium gray with a faint reddish stripe. Not a stone from the area immediately around the cabin. The geology near the cabin is different. This stone had come from somewhere else. From the river channel below, or from one of the side drainages. Someone had carried it there and left it. I picked it up and took it back to the cabin and put it in my pack. I have it in a jar on my windowsill in Sequim, along with 2 others that came after it, in subsequent seasons. What I am telling you is that we exchanged stones for 3 years. That was the form the communication took before the language developed further. The evidence is in my field notebooks and my jar on the windowsill, and in photographs I have not shared with anyone except one person, who I will tell you about. The language developed slowly. By the end of the 2015 Fall Patrol, I had identified 8 words: stay, go, cold, river, up, elk, man, no. Produced with varying clarity, consonants blunted and vowels elongated, but identifiable in context. I was learning to listen for meaning the way you listen when you are learning a language organized differently from your own. You do not get the word first. You get the situation, and then the word, and together they resolve. By the fall of 2016 patrol, I had added here, far, fire, water, bird, after, many, wrong. I want to fill in the 2015 Fall Patrol in more detail, because something happened that season that I have been thinking about since. It was the 3rd night of the patrol, late October, which in the upper Hoh means the alder has dropped most of its leaves, and the forest opens up in a way it does not in summer. The understory goes from dense to transparent, almost overnight when the alder goes. You can suddenly see 50, 60 feet into the trees in places where you could barely see 10 in August. That transparency changes the quality of the dark. More depth to it, more room. I had been in the cabin with the lantern on, reading when the smell came. The familiar smell, damp fur and living heat, and that particular underpresence of something biological doing what it does. I set down my book. What happened next was different from any previous encounter in one specific way. The vocalization started, the usual rising, declining structure, but it was not alone. It was answered. From a different direction, further up the slope and to the east, a second sound came back. Not identical. The same basic structure, but with a different tone, a different length to the declining tail. And then the first responded, and then the second. This was not 2 random animals calling into the night. This was a conversation with a spatial component. The 2 vocalizations were positioned at different points on the upper slope, and they were answering each other in what felt like a rhythm, a back and forth with pauses that matched what you hear in any conversation between people who are taking turns thinking before they speak. This was 3 years before the 2018 pre-dawn exchange I told you about. So by the time I heard those 2 voices above the cabin in October of 2018, it was not the first time. I had been hearing at minimum 2 individuals since 2015. I had just not fully registered it as significant until I put it together with the 2018 event. What I wrote in my field notebook that night was this: 2 distinct vocalizations, spatially separated by approximately 100 yards, alternating at intervals of 15 to 40 seconds, duration approximately 12 minutes. Not alarm calls, not distress. The quality is of exchange rather than signal. The 12 minutes ended and the forest went back to its ordinary sounds. I did not go outside. I turned the lantern back up and went back to my book, but I did not read a word of it for the next hour. I had been treating the evidence as a series of single-entity encounters. One relationship, while difficult to explain, has a certain manageable quality. You can hold it in your mind. Two entities changes the shape of everything. Two entities means a group with its own internal logic, its own needs and priorities that extend beyond any relationship with a single human. I was not the only one who mattered here. I was one data point in a larger picture I was only seeing a narrow slice of. I started to understand that what I was looking at was not one eccentric individual that happened to have learned my name. I was looking at the edge of something. That last word I want to come back to, because it is the hinge on which everything else turns. Wrong was the word I heard first, in a context that told me what we had been building to. Not in the September of 2016, but in the October patrol of 2017, which was the first time a longer, more sustained exchange happened. And in that exchange, the word wrong appeared in a way that changed every subsequent patrol I did. I need to lay a little groundwork before I get there, because the meaning of wrong in that context depends on a sequence of other observations that I had been making for years and that I had been trying to fit into a framework. The Olympic Peninsula is a specific ecological system, one of the most intact temperate rainforest ecosystems in the continental United States. It sits on the western slope of the Olympic Mountains, with the park, which is 922,000 acres, at its core. The park boundary is supposed to be a firewall. What is inside stays inside. What is outside, the timber operations, the development, the roads and the drainages and the agricultural land, stays outside. I had been watching, from the early years of my patrol, a series of changes in the upper Hoh that I did not like and that I reported through the standard channels, and that received the standard response, which is acknowledgement and non-action. The changes I am talking about were these: the river itself. The Hoh River's flow pattern in the upper drainage had been changing in ways that did not match the historical baseline. Not dramatically, not a crisis, by the metrics the Park Service used to evaluate crisis, but a drift, a slow movement of the trend lines in a direction that meant the Blue Glacier, which fed the upper Hoh, was losing mass. Not a secret. Climate science has been measuring Blue Glacier since the 1950s. The University of Washington has a long-term monitoring station on it. By 2010, the data showed the glacier had lost roughly 30% of its volume since measurements began. That is a known fact in the scientific literature. What is harder to convey from tables of numbers is what it looks like on the ground when you have been walking the same trail for 20 years. It looks like the upper river running lower in September than it used to. It looks like the exposed gravel bars wider than the old photographs show them. It looks like the cut bank at the first ford, which used to be chest-high at high flow, now barely reaching your waist in the same season that used to require a rope crossing. The upper basin, where I had had my first sighting in 2003, the High Hoh Basin with the tarn. I had been going up there every year for 16 years. By 2017, the tarn was smaller. Not dramatically, not gone. But the ring of exposed rock around its edge was wider every year. In 2003, there had been sedges growing to within 3 feet of the water on the east side. By 2017, the sedges were 8 feet from the water on the east side, and the ground between was dry, cracked mud. The elk. The Roosevelt elk herds in the Hoh are one of the most studied populations in the country. I had been watching one specific herd, what I privately called the Upper River herd, for my entire patrol career. 20 animals at peak, moving between the valley floor and the high meadows in seasonal rhythms that I knew well enough to predict. By 2015, I was seeing 17. By 2017, I was seeing 14. Population decline has multiple causes. I'm not saying I know why the herd was smaller. I am saying it was, and that a ranger who has watched the same herd for 20 years notices. I'd been writing these observations alongside the evidence of the other presence. not connecting them, just noting. The fall of 2017 is when they got connected. I'm going to be as precise as I can about what was said, as best as I could reconstruct it in the 8 pages I wrote in my field notebook that afternoon. Some of it was clear. Some of it I understood from context rather than from the word itself. Some of it I may have interpreted wrong. My interpretation of a partial exchange in a vocabulary of maybe 25 words is not a transcript. It is my best understanding. What happened was this. I had been at the patrol cabin for 3 days. The exchange of stones had been happening each morning. On the 3rd morning, instead of waiting at the tree line as it usually did, the entity came to the clearing edge and stayed there and began to speak. Not just a word or two, a sustained attempt at communication that lasted by my watch about 40 minutes. I sat on the cabin step and I listened and I asked, when I could, using the words I had. My vocabulary was limited. My responses were simple. But I was asking and it was answering, and over 40 minutes, in fragments, with silences, with repetitions of words when I did not respond in a way that indicated I had understood. This is what I assembled. There were more of them, not one, more of them in the upper drainage. It used many, and a gesture. One of the gestures I had learned over the 3 years, pointing out and away from the current location toward the ridge lines. Many, across the ridges. They had been there a long time. It used old in a way I had heard before, not as a description of a single thing, but as a general condition. Old. The country was old. They were old in it. They were going. This was the part that took the longest to resolve into meaning, because going and far and after kept appearing together in a combination I did not immediately understand. They were not leaving in the sense I first read it, not departing for a different location. They were being pushed. Something was pushing them. Not people directly, not the Park Service, not hunters. Something that the people were doing outside the park boundary, that was changing the park inside the boundary. The river, it indicated the river, and then it used wrong. The river is wrong, the water is wrong, the elk were wrong, the cold was wrong. Meaning not as cold as it should be. The wrong was not the cause, the wrong was the result. And then it said something I have been thinking about ever since. It used a combination I had not heard before, man and after and far together, and I did not understand the first 2 times it said it. The 3rd time it said it, it added many, many, and pointed out of the drainage toward the southeast, toward the direction that would take you out of the park and into the managed forests and the logged areas, and eventually to the towns on the coast. Man after far, many, many. I think what it was saying is this. It was telling me that what was coming was not sudden. It was slow. It was already here, but it had not arrived yet in the way it was going to arrive. It was telling me the change was coming from a distance and from a source that was not any one person or any one action. It was coming from all of it. All of us. The many, many. And it was going to drive the wrong through the whole system. The water, the cold, the animals, until the place where they had been for a very long time was no longer the place where they could stay. Stay. The first word. The word from 2013. I had thought stay meant stop walking away, stay in this location, stay with this communication that is beginning. And maybe it did mean that in 2013. But sitting on the cabin step in the October of 2017, listening to 40 minutes of the clearest communication I had ever received from whatever was in that forest, I thought, stay might also mean this is where you stay. This is where you belong. You, a human, in your Park Service uniform with your field notebook and your 20 years of watching this system change. You are the kind of person who stays, and we are the kind of people who cannot stay anymore. I do not know if that is what was meant. I am telling you what I heard and what I thought. The entity withdrew after about 40 minutes. I sat on the step for a long time after it left. Then I went inside and wrote for 2 hours. I filled 8 pages in the field notebook, front and back, trying to get all of it down while it was still sharp. The specific word combinations, the gestures, the order, the pauses. That notebook is in my desk on sequem. I'm going to pause here for a moment and come back to this, because what happened over the next 2 years, the 2018 and 2019 patrols, deepened everything I have just told you. And because there is one more person I need to tell you about, the one person I eventually shared all of this with, and what happened when I did. But before I get there, I want to sit with what the October 2017 exchange told me, because I think it deserves a moment. We treat the Olympic backcountry as a preserve, a place we have protected. The park was established in 1938, 87 years ago. The intention of the protection was to keep that ecosystem functioning as a whole. Roosevelt elk, temperate rainforest, salmon in the river, glacier feeding the headwaters. One system, the glacier is losing 30% of its volume. The river is lower in September than it was 20 years ago. The elk herd I watched for 26 years was 6 animals, smaller when I retired than when I started. And something that had been in that drainage for, in its own estimation, a very long time, was preparing to leave, organizing itself to move. Going far, it had told me, because the place had gone wrong in a way that nothing inside the park boundary had done. The wrong was coming from outside, from the many, from all of us and the accumulated weight of everything we are doing, to the air and the water and the temperature, from changes that do not respect a park boundary, that follow the rivers and the weather patterns and the ocean currents without stopping to check whether they have crossed a line on a map. I am someone who walked the same 18 miles of trail for 26 years and paid close attention. What I am telling you is what I observed in my own field notebooks, dated, measured, consistent, and what I was told in 40 minutes of the most careful listening I have ever done by something that had been paying closer attention for much longer. Stay. I think they wanted someone to stay and know what had been here, and say it out loud, the way I am saying it now. That is why I am telling you. Come back. Because in the 2018 and 2019 patrols, the last 2 before I retired, what happened changed the weight of everything I had seen before it. And there is something about the October 2019 patrol, my last one, that I have not yet told you, that I am going to tell you now, that I have not told anyone except the one person I mentioned. And when I tell you what it was, I think you will understand why it took me this long to say it out loud. Let me back up to the spring of 2018, because what happened that April set up everything that followed. The spring patrol was always different from the fall. The park is waking up in April, expanding, loud, full of water from snowmelt and rain. Spring patrols were operationally harder, but the park in spring had a vitality to it that I loved. The smell of skunk cabbage, the sound of Wilson's warblers in the alder stands, the dipper working the fast sections of the Hoh, that small gray bird that walks into the current like it does not apply to it. The spring of 2018 patrol started normally. I was at the trailhead at 6 in the morning, signed in, began the 18-mile walk to the upper cabin with a 4-day plan. The lower third of the trail was the same as always. The Hall of Mosses Junction, the first creek crossing on the footlog, the long straight stretch through the older growth where the canopy was thick enough that the understory was open, no brush, just the cathedral of the spruce trunks going up and up. What I noticed in the lower section, I had been noticing for a while. The alder stands were advancing in places where previously they had not been, moving into the margins of the conifer forest. Alder is a succession plant. It moves into disturbed ground. The rate of advance seemed off. I made a note. I kept walking. At mile 12, where the old growth becomes more mixed and the trail is closer to the river. I found the first thing that stopped me. On the east bank of the Hoh, visible from the trail, the gravel bar had been reconfigured by the winter flow. This was normal. High water in winter moves gravel bars. What was not normal was the section of the east bank where the bar had retreated back from what I was used to seeing. A section of bank, maybe 40 feet wide, had slumped into the river. The root mat of the riverside vegetation undercut and collapsed. The trees at the edge of the bank, 3 large Sitka spruce that I had walked past every patrol for 20 years, were now leaning over the river at angles that had not been there in October. I photographed it and noted the location and moved on. At mile 14, the patrol cabin. I had been coming to this cabin for 17 years. I knew it the way you know a place you have spent hundreds of nights alone in. The corrugated metal roof, the single-pane window on the south wall, the propane tank on the east side, chained to the wall, that was always 60 to 70% full when I arrived and that the Park Service checked every season. The wood box by the door that I had filled and stacked myself more times than I could count. The first sign that something was different was the wood box. It was not empty, which I would have noted because that would mean a previous user had not restocked it. It was full. Fully stacked, neatly, with pieces of red alder of consistent length. I had not put that wood there. The fall patrol had ended in October, and the box at that time had been about half full. Someone or something had added wood to it, between October and April. I noted it and went inside. The inside of the cabin was as I had left it in October. The field notes I keep in the cabin, a separate journal from the one in my pack, were in the same position in the wooden box on the shelf. The lantern was where I had left it. The mouse exclusion I use for my food supplies was undisturbed. But on the sleeping platform, centered precisely on the surface, was a stone. Not the kind of stone I had been exchanging with the entity in the fall patrols. Larger, about the size of my hand, laid flat, dark gray, river-smoothed, with a pattern of white quartz inclusions running in an arc across the face of it like a shallow curve, almost like a mark. Not a mark, a natural formation, but one that would not have been easy to pick as unremarkable from the riverbed. Someone who was looking at stones carefully would have found it. I held the stone in my hands for a long time. Then I set it on the shelf above the sleeping platform and unpacked my gear. That first evening I was on the cabin step at dusk with my tea, and I had the sense, not clearly located in any single piece of sensory data, that I was being watched from the upper slope, not anxiously. The way you feel that a room you have just entered has someone in it, a quality of occupation that precedes confirmation. I said quietly, out loud, "I see the stone. Thank you." The woods did not answer. The river kept going. A varied thrush called from somewhere in the spruce below the cabin. I drank my tea and went inside. The next 3 days of that April patrol were the quietest and also the strangest of any patrol I had done, which, given everything I have already told you, means something. There was no direct sighting, no close vocalization. But on the morning of the second day, I walked up to the forest edge at the upper clearing, and I found, in the duff at the base of the boundary spruce, something I had not seen before. Not a stone, a piece of bark. Roughly rectangular, maybe 8 inches long and 4 inches wide, stripped clean from whatever tree it had come from. On the interior surface of the bark, the smooth side, there were marks. I want to be very careful here. I am not going to tell you these were symbolic marks, or language, or any kind of writing. I do not know what they were. What I can tell you is that they were not random. They had a regularity to them, a spacing, a relationship between the marks that appeared organized rather than accidental. There were 7 marks. They ran in a diagonal from the upper left to the lower right of the bark face. They were not scratched. They were pressed. The way you make a mark in clay or wet bark with something firm and blunt. Each mark was about a 1/4 inch deep and maybe an inch long, with a slight curve at one end, not fingernail marks. The radius of the curve was different, wider. I photographed the bark from 4 angles. I noted the size and orientation of the marks. I took the bark back to the cabin and put it in my pack, to take out at the end of the patrol. I still have it. It is in a plastic sleeve in my desk in Sequim. On the morning of the 3rd day, I went up to the Hoh Basin. The tarn was smaller again. The reference rock I had been using since 2010 had exposed 4 more inches of its face since October. The sedge line on the east bank was now 9 feet from the water. In my field notebook from that morning, in the margin, I wrote 1 sentence that was not an observation note. I wrote, "How long do they have?" I packed up, and on the step before I left, I placed both stones, the pale gray one from the previous fall and the white quartz-veined stone that had been on the sleeping platform when I arrived. I put them on the step and walked away. The fall of 2018 patrol was the penultimate, my second to last, and what happened on the second night of that patrol was the clearest communication I had ever received. I had put the stone out on the step the first morning, as I had been doing since 2014. That night after dark, I heard movement on the step outside. I opened the door. The step was empty, but at the lower edge on the ground were 2 stones, both river-worn, both unfamiliar. One had a dark band running through it. The other was creamy off-white, not local geology. I went back inside and turned the lantern low and sat and waited. About 20 minutes later, I heard the vocalization. Not from the upper slope where I usually heard it, from the north side of the cabin, below the cabin toward the river. Lower than before, quieter, like it was not projecting but speaking toward me, specifically. The same rising, declining structure, and within it words I could make out in the dark and the quiet. Wrong, river, cold, gone, far, many, after. And then one word I had not heard before in any of our exchanges, a word I had to work to parse from the shape of it, because the consonants were blunted and the vowels stretched. Remember. That is what I heard. I wrote it down immediately, without turning on the lantern, wrote in the dark by touch on the page of my field notebook. Remember. The vocalization lasted about 15 minutes. When it stopped, the night went back to its ordinary sounds, and I sat in the dark of the patrol cabin on the upper Hoh River for a long time. And I thought about what it means to be asked by something that cannot write it down, or record it, or submit it to a journal. To remember. These are not animals asking. Whatever the entity or entities in the upper Hoh drainage are, they have a vocabulary. They know what remembering means. They know that it is possible to give a word to a person who has no other way to carry it out, and that the word will travel. That is a sophisticated understanding of how memory works between different kinds of minds. I am the word they gave to carry out the. That is what I think remember means. The way it was used. Not remember what you have seen, though that too. Remember and carry it. Remember for us. Because we are going to stop being here to remember for ourselves. I thought about the Hall of Mosses, the way the big-leaf maple grows there in a shape that takes your breath, the way the moss hangs down 2 and 3 feet from every branch, and the light comes through it, green and diffuse. I thought about the first time I walked through it in 1993 and understood that I had never been in an old forest before. Not really, just in trees. I thought about the upper river meadows in late August when the fireweed goes to seed, and the whole drainage is full of floating white. I thought about the sound of the Hoh after a big rain when it goes up 2 feet overnight, and the color changes from gray-green to the brownish milk of glacial flower, and you can hear the boulders moving on the river bottom like distant thunder. I thought about all of it. And I thought about the entity that had been in that country for a very long time, whose name for itself I did not know, and could not ask, who had exchanged stones with me for 3 years. and then given me 40 minutes of the most careful communication I had ever received, who was now, in the dark, asking me to remember. I stayed awake the rest of that night, not because I was afraid, because it seemed like the right response to a request of that kind. The next morning, before I began the walk out, I sat on the step and I said out loud to the forest, "I will remember. I will say it out loud. Whatever is in this country and whatever it has seen is real, and I will not be quiet about it." Then I picked up my pack, and I walked the 18 miles to the trailhead, and I got in my truck, and I drove to Sequim. I retired the following year, October 2019. My final patrol was the last week of the month. On the last night of that patrol, the night before I walked out for good, something happened that I have not told anyone except one person. I want to tell you that one person first, because they matter to the story, and because what they know changes the weight of what I am about to say. Her name is Patricia Bose. She is a biologist at the University of Washington in Seattle, working in the Department of Ecology. I have known Patricia for 12 years, since 2011, when we met at a workshop on Roosevelt elk population dynamics at the Olympic National Park Research Station. She is rigorous. She is not someone who comes easily to unconventional conclusions. She is also someone who has spent a significant portion of her career looking at population decline in Roosevelt elk herds along the Hoh River corridor, and who has been watching the same data I have been watching through instruments and models rather than through field notebooks and patrol records. I told Patricia everything in a 6-hour conversation in my kitchen in Sequim in February of 2020, 4 months after I retired. I had been organizing my field notebooks and photographs for the conversation for several weeks. I laid them all out. She listened for 6 hours, asked questions, looked at the photographs, handled the marked bark without saying anything for a long time. When I was done, Patricia said, "What you are describing is consistent with a population under pressure from environmental change, moving toward a range shift," which is the scientific language for what the entity had told me in October of 2017. Going far. The wrong coming from the many, the place becoming a place they could not stay in. She also said, "I don't know what made those marks on the bark." She held it up to the kitchen light and turned it over. She said, "I don't know what produced those tracks." She looked at the photographs for a long time. She said, "I believe you. I believe you saw what you saw. I believe something was in those drainages. Whether it is still there and what it is, I cannot tell you. Patricia and I have been meeting regularly since 2020. She is, as of this year, preparing a paper that documents the population trajectory of Roosevelt elk in the upper Hoh corridor over the past 30 years. The numbers are not good. The population has declined at a rate that exceeds what her models predict based on known stressors. She does not attribute the excess decline to any one cause. She does not speculate. She reports what the data shows. She is the one person I had told, until now. The last night of my career in the Olympic backcountry was October 30th, 2019. I was alone in the patrol cabin, as I had been hundreds of times before. I had done my exchange of stones in the morning. I had done the day loop. I had eaten my dinner and written my last patrol notes, and I was sitting on the step in the dark with the door open behind me, and the lantern inside casting light out through the window. The smell came before anything else. The damp fur and living heat smell that I had first noticed 16 years earlier on the other side of the park, in the high Hoh basin, sitting on a boulder at a tarn that was already smaller than it should have been. Familiar now. The smell of something I had been in the presence of across hundreds of hours, spread over many seasons. Then footsteps from the upper slope. Unhurried, coming down. It came into the clearing, not to the tree line. Into the clearing itself, 50 feet from where I sat on the step. The most open approach I had ever seen it make. In the ambient light from the lantern through the window, I could see the shape of it clearly. The height, the shoulders, the shape of the head, the hands at the sides. We sat there for a while, or I sat, and it stood. The river went on below us, then it spoke. More words than I had ever heard at once. Some I knew, some I did not. But embedded in it, clearly, in the order I am going to give them to you, were these: river, wrong, far, cold, wrong. Elk, far, many, far, go, far. After, far. Remember, remember. Man, stay. Remember, and then the word I had not heard before that night. The word was thank. I am a person who does not cry easily. I have been alone in the backcountry in conditions that would have reduced most people to distress, and I have been calm. It is a professional training that becomes a personal characteristic after enough years. I cried on that step. I could not help it. I put my hands over my face and I sat there on the last step of my last patrol, in the park I had spent 26 years in, and I listened to the entity that had been telling me things across 16 years of exchange with drawback, up the slope into the old growth in the dark, and I cried until I stopped. Then I wiped my face and went inside and wrote in my field notebook for 2 hours. In the morning I packed my pack, put my last stone on the step and walked the 18 miles out. I have not been back since. I drive past the turnoff for the Hoh sometimes, going through the lower peninsula, and I do not stop, not because it is painful, though it is, because I am not sure what I would be going back to see, whether what was there is still there, whether the exchange is still available, whether the country has gone further wrong in the years since I last walked it. What I do instead is this. I sit at my kitchen table in Sequim on the dry side of the peninsula with my jar of stones on the windowsill, and I write and I remember and I tell you what I was asked to tell you. The upper Hoh drainage is one of the most intact ecosystems left in the continental United States. The glacier feeding it has lost 30% of its volume since measurements began in the 1950s. The river runs lower in September than it did 20 years ago. The Roosevelt elk herd I watched for 26 years was smaller when I retired than when I started, by a number that Patricia Osei's models do not fully account for. Something that had been in that country for a very long time, longer than the park, longer than any record, was preparing to leave, had been preparing to leave across years of accelerating pressure, was telling a park ranger on her last night in the backcountry, thank you, and remember, and man, stay, stay and remember, that is what I was asked to do, that is what I am doing. I'm going to pause here and pick this up in the second part of this, because there is more to tell about what Patricia has found in her data. About one thing I have not yet said about the October 2018 patrol that changes the shape of everything. And about what happened in the summer of 2021, 2 years after I retired, when I got a call from a trail crew working a section of the upper Hoh that made me sit down on the floor of my kitchen in Sequim and not move for a while. Come back. Here is what happened next. I told you about the fall patrol of 2018, about the vocalization in the dark, the words I made out, the word remember. What I did not tell you was what happened the following morning, on the last day of that patrol, in the hour before I packed my gear and began the walk out. I want to tell you now. I was up before light, which in late October, in the Hoh, means up before 6. I made coffee on the propane stove and sat on the step with the door open and the lantern going behind me. The forest before dawn has a particular quality, not quiet, because the Hoh is never quiet. The river sees to that, but stiller than daylight. The birds not yet started, the air colder and denser, the smell of the forest floor more pronounced in the cold. That resinous, biological, alive smell of a temperate rainforest at rest. I drank my coffee and I waited. I do not know if I expected something. I'm not sure I was expecting anything specific after what had happened the night before. The night before had felt like a closing, a final statement in a conversation that had been building for years. I was sitting on that step the way you sit after a very long conversation with someone you trust deeply, and you have run out of things to say, and you are just in the same space together before one of you has to leave. I was not sitting there hoping for more. I was sitting there being present for the last morning I had. About 20 minutes after first light, when the birds had begun, I heard movement from the upper slope, not coming down this time, parallel to the cabin, moving east along the high ground above the trail. The sound of something large moving through the forest in a way that was not concealed, not stalking, just moving. The footfall of it, bipedal, that distinctive, slightly longer stride. It moved parallel to me for maybe 200 yards, east along the upper slope. Then it stopped. Then from the east, a different vocalization answered, lower register than the one I was used to, deeper. A single note, rising, held for about 4 seconds. Not the same individual I had been communicating with, different. The first vocalization answered, a short response, then quiet. 2 individuals in communication in the old growth above the patrol cabin in the pre-dawn of a late October morning. Not communicating with me, communicating with each other. I held very still and I listened. The exchange lasted maybe 8 minutes, back and forth, with pauses. 2 different voices, 2 different registers, not identical. Not even the same kind of different that you would get from, say, 2 individual black bears or 2 individual elk. This was different in the way that 2 people's voices are different. Particular, identifiable. One with a quality I had been hearing for 6 years, one I had never heard. After 8 minutes, both went quiet. I heard the movement of the first one continue east along the upper slope, away from the cabin, moving toward the ridge. And that was all. I went inside and wrote 2 pages. Then I packed and walked out. What I wrote in those 2 pages was this: there is more than one. The single entity I had been building a relationship with was part of a group. The pre-dawn exchange was a coordination between individuals who had things to tell each other in the early morning. I had been thinking about one relationship. I was inside something larger. That realization, sitting in the truck at the trailhead with my coffee going cold, was the thing that made me decide to retire. Not because it frightened me, because the next step in the relationship was not available to a park ranger on a 4-day patrol. It required a different kind of presence than I could offer while I was a federal employee with patroller responsibilities and a radio that was supposed to be on from 7 to 7. I put in my retirement paperwork in January of 2019. Final date, October 31st, 2019, the day after my last patrol. Now, the summer of 2021. I told you at the end of part 1 that I got a phone call that made me sit down on my kitchen floor in Sequim. Let me tell you about that. The call came in August. The caller was a young woman, 24 years old, who was working as a volunteer trail crew member with the Olympic National Park Trail Maintenance Program. She had been on a crew working a section of the Upper Hoh between miles 11 and 13, doing brushwork and drainage clearing. She had found something and she did not know what to do with it. She had found me because she had asked the trail crew supervisor if any long-term patrol rangers had worked the Upper Hoh corridor, and the supervisor had given her my name and Sequim contact number. She described what she had found, a structure in the old growth off the east side of the trail at mile 12. In a hollow between 2 root masses, not far from a section I knew well, a frame of branches arranged in parallel rows with a larger piece as a ridgepole. The branches were not broken. They were snapped laterally, clean breaks. Different species, hemlock and alder mixed. The ridgepole at 4 feet off the ground at the center. I said, "Can you send me photographs?" She sent me 8 photographs by text message, sitting in her tent at the group camp in the lower park. I looked at them on my phone, in my kitchen in Sequim, and that is when I sat down on the floor. The structure she had found was not the same structure I had documented in September of 2006. I know the exact location of that structure. Mile 12, in the hollow between two specific root masses, a feature I could locate from the GPS waypoint in my old field notes. The structure she had found was at a different hollow, at mile 12.4, a quarter mile further east. Two structures, the same design, the same construction method, 15 years apart. I called her back. I told her I had seen something similar, that I thought the structures were animal in origin, that she should photograph and note the location and flag it to the Park Service Resource Management Office through her supervisor, which is what you are supposed to do when you encounter something anomalous in the backcountry. I did not tell her everything. She was 24, and she was on a trail crew, and she had a supervisor, and she did not need the weight of what I knew. But after I hung up, I sat on my kitchen floor for a long time, and I thought about the 8 minutes of pre-dawn vocalization I had heard in October of 2018. Two individuals, more than one. And I thought, they are still there. The structures, separated by 15 years and a quarter mile, meant ongoing presence, continued activity in the corridor. Whatever had been happening in the upper Hoh drainage was still happening. I thought about the word far, going far, after, and then I thought, or they have not yet gone, or going is a longer process than I imagined. I want to be honest with you about the limits of my knowledge here. Everything I have told you so far is documented. Field notebooks, photographs, the GPS waypoints, the structural measurements, the track measurements. 16 years of documented observations from a federal employee with training in field protocols and a professional reason to be accurate. The trail crew volunteers find in 2021 is documented in her photographs and her report to her supervisor, which is in the Park Service records. What I cannot tell you is what was communicated in those 40 minutes in October of 2017 with the kind of precision I would need to claim I fully understood it. I can tell you the words I made out. I can tell you my interpretation of their meaning, based on context, and 6 years of building that vocabulary. I cannot tell you I am right. What I can tell you is what the data says. The data that Patricia Osei presented to me in my kitchen in Sequim in March of 2022, which is the most recent time we sat down and went through all of it together, since she had finished the draft of her elk population paper, The Roosevelt Elk in the Upper Hoh Corridor. The population Patricia has been tracking since 2008 through GPS collaring and aerial surveys. She has data on this specific population going back further than her own work, because the Park Service has been doing surveys on the Hoh elk since 1980, 37 years of data. The trend line from 1986 to 2008 showed a stable population with normal fluctuations. The trend line from 2008 to 2022 showed a decline that projects the upper river herd to non-viability within the next 10 to 15 years. A population so small that a bad winter or a disease outbreak leaves no recovery capacity. Patricia identified the primary stressors as forage quality reduction, related to changing precipitation patterns, and a shift in the snowpack timing that alters the spring green-up schedule. And a secondary stressor harder to quantify, habitat anxiety. Elk under stress move differently. They avoid exposed meadows and ridge crossings, their best forage areas, and concentrate in the valley bottoms, which are safer but nutritionally inferior. She does not know why the upper Hoh elk are showing elevated habitat anxiety. She has a hypothesis, which she has not published, which she shared with me in March of 2022 as a hypothesis, not a finding. Her hypothesis is that the upper Hoh elk may be responding to a change in the presence of a large territorial animal in the drainage that is itself responding to habitat pressure. When an apex-level territorial presence changes its behavior, The animals organized around that behavior for generations go into a period of instability. She said this carefully and precisely and qualified at every step. And then she stopped talking and looked at the jar of stones on my windowsill, the 3 river-worn stones I had brought back from the upper Hoh across 3 different patrol seasons. She said, "I cannot put any of what you have told me in my paper. You understand that?" I said I understood. She said, "But I think you are right that the system is connected. I think whatever was in that drainage was part of the system in a way that we do not have a category for. And I think its behavior over the past 10 or 15 years is consistent with an animal that is experiencing the pressure of a habitat in decline." We sat in my kitchen for a while after that. Then she said, "Remember is an interesting word for it to use. The corridor between miles 12 and 15 runs through some of the oldest trees in the park. Sitka spruce that were already 300 years old when the park was established in 1938, some of them over 400 years old. When those trees were seedlings, the native people of the Hoh Valley were living and working in that corridor, fishing the river, elk hunting on the slopes above. The Hoh tribe, whose name for themselves and for the river are the same word, has been associated with this drainage since before any written record. Their oral history goes back to a time when the landscape was different than it is now, when the glacier above was larger and the river louder. They have knowledge of the upper drainage that no Park Service interpretive program has ever fully documented. I have met, through conversations over the years, 2 Hoh tribe members who have talked to me about the upper drainage. Not at length, not in the context of what I was observing, in the context of what they know about the land their people have been connected to. What I can say, without putting words in their mouths or making claims about their traditional knowledge that are not mine to make, is that the understanding of the upper drainage as occupied by something other than the documented wildlife species is not new. It is not a recent story. The specific acknowledgement that the upper river country is shared space, that has a history and a set of rules that predate the Park Service and predate the written record, is embedded in how those conversations were structured. I'm not going to say more than that. It is not my knowledge to elaborate. But I want you to understand that what I was encountering in the upper Hoh, over 16 years of patrol, was not new to the place. I was the newcomer in a relationship that had been going on for a very long time before I arrived. Let me tell you about the fall of 2016, which I skimmed over earlier, because there was something in that patrol that I need to come back to. The fall of 2016 was the last patrol before the October 2017 conversation. It was also the patrol in which the structure I had first documented in 2006 appeared in a modified form. I will explain what I mean. In September of 2006, I had documented a frame structure in the hollow at mile 12. I had photographed it. I had visited the site on every subsequent patrol, fall and spring, for 10 years. For 9 of those years, the structure had been there, slowly weathering, the branches settling into the duff. The ridgepole, which had been a green-cut piece of alder when I first saw it, had dried and grayed over the years. On the spring 2015 patrol, it was still there, recognizable, weathered. On the fall 2015 patrol, still there, further weathered, one of the cross branches collapsed. On the spring 2016 patrol, it was gone. Not scattered, not collapsed in place. Gone. The hollow was emptied duff, nothing but the depression between the root masses and the faint compaction marks in the moss, where the original structure had rested. On the fall 2016 patrol, there was a new structure in the same hollow. Fresh. Greenwood. Same design, same dimensions, same construction method, rebuilt. I stood in that hollow for 10 minutes and looked at it. A structure I had been watching for 10 years had been replaced. Same location, same form, rebuilt from new material. Not by weather, which does not do that. not by any natural process I am aware of. The original had been removed and a new one built in its place. Someone had maintained the structure. I documented it the same way I had documented the original. I took 8 photographs, measured the ridgepole, noted the species of wood. I wrote 4 pages in my field notebook. I did not report it formally. In the years since I retired, I have thought about that hollow and what it represents more than I have thought about anything else from my patrol career. A constructed form, maintained over at least a decade, that I observed, rebuilt when it reached the end of its useful life. That is not animal behavior in any framework I know how to apply. That is the behavior of a group that values a place enough to maintain a marker of its presence there across time. That is what people do. I have a friend who grew up in rural western Montana and spent a lot of years guiding hunters in the Selway Bitterroot wilderness. He told me once over drinks in a bar in Port Angeles that in 30 years of guiding he had twice found structures in the backcountry that he could not explain. Not shelters, not trail markers, not anything a human had built for utility. Constructions that seemed to serve a different purpose, marking or signaling or claiming in a way he did not have a framework for. He described them the way I would have described the Mile 12 structure: organized, intentional, too specific to be random. He had not talked about them publicly. He is still guiding. He has a business and a reputation, and he is not going to call a press conference about stick structures in the Selway. I told him I had something similar. I told him about the Upper Hoh. I did not tell him everything, but I told him enough. He said, "Something is out there. I don't know what it is, but it's not nothing." That is the level at which most people in the backcountry hold this knowledge. Not nothing, not a hallucination, not a story, not nothing. The issue is that not nothing does not get published in scientific journals. Not nothing does not get the attention of land management agencies or wildlife biologists, or anyone with the institutional standing to do something with it. Not nothing lives in the back of a field notebook, in a desk drawer in Sequim, and in the memories of guides in Montana and trail crew volunteers who find structures at Mile 12 and do not know who to call. This is why I am telling you. This is the carrying out of remember, because remember is not private. Remember is not sitting in your kitchen with 3 stones in a jar and a folder of photographs and a stack of field notebooks, and never saying anything. Remember is saying it out loud to someone who can hear it. You are the someone. I drove the Lower Hoh Road in April of this year and walked into the Hall of Mosses. I have not been on the backcountry trail since I retired. I stood there on a Tuesday morning in April with maybe 12 other visitors, and I thought, this is still here. This part is still here. The moss hangs down 2 and 3 feet from every branch. The light comes through it green and diffuse. It looks ancient. It looks permanent. It is not permanent. The Hall of Mosses is connected to everything that is happening higher up, through the hydrology and the soil and the animal populations and the climate of the whole system. The roots of the trees drink from the same watershed that the Blue Glacier feeds. The elk that come down in winter are the same population whose numbers have been declining for 15 years. The Hall of Mosses is still beautiful. The Upper Hoh drainage is not still intact. Those 2 things can both be true. I want to tell you one more thing about the October 2019 patrol, my last one. Something I have mentioned but not yet said fully. The word thank. In 26 years of patrol, I had exchanged information with the Park Service radio dispatch, with Park Service visitors, with other rangers, with trail crew leaders and research scientists, and elk biologists, and students doing field work. I had exchanged information with an entity in the Upper Hoh drainage for 16 years, fragments, gestures, stones, marks on bark. None of those exchanges had ended with thank. Thank was not the last word of the October 2019 vocalization. The words at the end were man, stay, remember, but thank came before those. And before thank came everything else. River wrong, far. Cold wrong, elk far. Many far, go far, after far. And then thank. Thank for what? I have thought about this many times since. Thank for paying attention. Thank for the stones, for the years of exchange, for the walking out and the walking in again across 26 seasons. Thank for being the kind of person who stays in a place long enough to understand what is wrong with it. I think thank is also an acknowledgement of a relationship, a naming of what we had been doing for 16 years. We had been exchanging attention and presence and eventually communication. And at the end of it, before one of the parties leaves, you say, thank. I am crying now, at my kitchen table in Sequim, writing this. I am not embarrassed by that. Some things deserve tears. Patricia Osei and I are planning a joint project, a data collection effort back in the upper Hoh corridor. Systematic, documenting every form of anomalous evidence that falls outside the known species catalog of the park. We will do this the way you do good field science, carefully, without predetermined conclusions. And we will work with Hoh tribe members who are willing to participate because their knowledge of that drainage is part of the same body of evidence. I do not know if we will find what I found over 16 years. I do not know if the presence that taught me those words is still in the upper drainage or has gone far. The trail crew volunteers' photographs from 2021 suggest ongoing activity, but 2021 is 4 years ago now, and the pressure on the system has not decreased. I know that the glacier is smaller. I know that the river is lower. I know that the elk are fewer. I know that something that had been in that country for a very long time had over 6 years of the most specific communication available to it, told me that the system was failing in a way that was driving it out. And I know that on the last night of my career, in the dark of the patrol cabin at mile 14, it said, thank, and man, stay, and remember. I am staying, I am remembering. Let me tell you the specific things I remember. The smell of the upper drainage in late October, that damp fur and living heat smell that I first encountered in 2003, and that became over the years a marker of presence, the way a particular person's cologne becomes associated with their arrival in a room. I can still produce it in memory with fidelity. I do not know how to describe it to someone who has not encountered it. It is alive in a way that no description captures. The quality of the Stellar's alarm call in the section between miles 12 and 15. The specific register it drops to, shorter and lower than the standard call, in the presence of the entity. I have not heard that call anywhere since I retired. I have not been back to the section of trail where I heard it. I hear it in my memory clearly. The shape of the tracks in the consolidated snowpack in April of 2008. The 16.5-inch length, the depth of 4 inches in the crust, the mid-tarsal break visible in the center of the foot impression, that extra joint in the arch that human anatomy does not have, and bear anatomy does not have, the stride of 59 inches between centers, the direction of travel northeast, toward the shoulder of the ridge and whatever was on the other side of it, the 7 marks on the bark. In parallel, diagonal, pressed with the curve of something wider than a human fingernail. Organized, but in a way I do not have a language for, in a grammar I did not learn. I have looked at those marks hundreds of times in the years since I brought the bark down from the upper drainage. I do not know what they mean. I know they mean something. The 40 minutes of the October 2017 conversation, the words in the order I received them, the pauses between them, the way certain words came several times, as if repetition was emphasis, or as if I had not responded in a way that indicated understanding and the entity was trying a different approach to the same meaning. Wrong, river, many, far. The way the combination assembled itself into something I could parse, the way you eventually hear the word in a language you are learning when someone says it slowly enough, with enough context around it. The pre-dawn exchange of October 2018. Two voices, two individuals, in the old growth above the patrol cabin, talking to each other in the dark. A coordination that I was not part of, that was not for me, that happened in my presence because I had been present in that drainage for long enough that my presence was no longer a reason to conceal it. The word thank. Spoken in the dark of October 2019, in a voice I had been listening to since 2013, by something that was preparing to go far, and wanted to say, before it did, that the exchange had mattered. I am the memory of what was there. I'm the word that was given to someone who could carry it out. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a policy maker. I'm a retired park ranger with a jar of stones on my windowsill, and a desk full of field notebooks, and a folder of photographs that I have not yet decided what to do with. I am the specific human being who was in the specific place, at the specific time, for long enough that something chose to talk to me. But I am alive. I can say out loud what was in that drainage. I can say the river is wrong, and the cold is wrong, and the elk are far, and many have gone far, and that what drove them there was not the park, not the trail, not the rangers in their NPS uniforms and their patrol cabins and their field notebooks. What drove them was everything outside, the boundary that does not stop weather, the air that does not check permits, the temperature of the ocean that the rivers drain into, rising by degrees, that do not care about the park boundary on a map. That is what I was asked to remember, and that is what I am telling you. The upper Hoh drainage is still one of the most beautiful and intact ecosystems in the continental United States. If you have never been there, go. Walk the Hall of Mosses. Stand in the old growth between miles 3 and 7 and look up at the canopy and try to understand what 200 years of continuous growth looks like. Walk to the first ford and listen to the river. If you can get a backcountry permit, do the full 18 miles to Glacier Meadows and stand at the foot of the moraine below the Blue Glacier and look at where the ice used to be, the trim line of the old glacier edge on the valley walls, high above, where the ice is now. Look at that trim line. Remember where the ice was. The Hoh tribe has been connected to this drainage for thousands of years. Their sovereignty and their knowledge and their relationship to the landscape are real and ongoing. The Hoh tribe's environmental concerns about the health of the drainage, about the salmon in the lower river, about the elk, about the quality of the water coming down off the glacier, are not separate from what I am telling you. They are the same concern from a different position, with a much longer record. Their knowledge is not supplementary, it is primary. Something asked a park ranger to remember and to say it out loud, and she spent 5 years deciding whether she was going to do that, and she has decided to do it. Whatever is in the upper Hoh had been there long enough to learn her name from her name tag and the trail register, long enough to build a structure and maintain it for over a decade, long enough to develop a vocabulary adequate to carry the meaning of river wrong, cold wrong, elk far, many gone, going far, after. Remember, long enough to know what thank means and when to say it. I am here. I am saying it out loud. If you have been in the upper Hoh and you have had an experience you did not know what to do with, I want to hear from you. Seriously, not to collect stories, not to compile some kind of catalog. Because the kind of patient, careful, documented observation that I am describing is not something one person can do alone in one place. There are people in other drainages, other backcountry corridors, other parks and wilderness areas who have been having their version of what I had and who have not yet found a framework for talking about it. The framework I am offering is this: pay attention, document carefully. Do not perform certain about what you are seeing before you have enough data to support any conclusion. Keep walking and keep looking. and when something has been asking you to listen for long enough, listen. The upper Hoh corridor is still there. The Blue Glacier is still there, smaller every year. The patrol cabin is still there, occupied by rangers who did not know what I knew when I was sleeping on that platform. And somewhere above the upper drainage, in whatever direction far means, when it is spoken by something that has been in one place longer than the Park Service has existed, something is moving, slowly, the way things move when they have been somewhere for a very long time and they are finally leaving. Man, stay. I am staying. Remember, I will. Subscribe if you want to hear more. There are other places where this kind of thing is happening. This is a thing that is real in the world, that has been real for a very long time, that is responding to the world we are making the way everything responds to the world we are making. By changing, by moving, by going. Stay and remember, I am doing both. Let me stay in this for a while longer, because there are things I keep circling back to that I have not yet said clearly, and the reason they matter is not just the experience itself, but what the experience points to. The people who stay in the Park Service long-term tend to share one quality: sustained attention over years, even when the data is ambiguous, even when the institutional response is a combination of acknowledgement and non-action. We do not celebrate the 17 years of walking the same trail before the thing that matters happens. But the 17 years is what makes the thing that matters mean what it means. Without the baseline, you do not understand the deviation. 17 years of accumulated knowledge of what the upper Hoh looks and sounds and smells and feels like is what allowed me to understand that what I was hearing in October of 2017 was not just sounds, but meaning. Sustained attention is what I am asking you to bring to this, whatever your version of this is. Years of the same place, the same season, the same patience. If you are the kind of person who can do that, you are the kind of person this kind of knowledge finds. I want to talk about the language question more fully, because I think it is the part of what I have told you that people are going to push back on hardest, and I want to address it directly rather than let it sit. The question is, how does something produce English words? It is a fair question. It requires an answer that is not just, I heard them, so they were said. Let me give you my best understanding based on what I observed. The Upper Hoh River Trail has been in use as a maintained trail since the 1920s, when the Park Service began formal development of the trail system in what would become Olympic National Park. Before that, the route was a pack trail used by stockmen and prospectors, going back to the late 1800s. And before that, a travel route used by Hoh tribe members and their ancestors for purposes of seasonal movement, hunting, and trade, going back many thousands of years. That is a very long period of human presence in that corridor. If something has been in the Upper Hoh drainage for a very long time and has been attending to the humans passing through that corridor, that something has had decades upon decades of exposure to English-speaking humans. Not just exposure. Systematic, repeated, high-information exposure. Hikers talk to each other. Trail crews coordinate vocally. Rangers like me narrate the environment into field notebooks while speaking aloud to help with memory. Researchers call out measurements and observations. Visitors read interpretive signs to each other. For decades upon decades of that, in a corridor where the human presence is seasonal and concentrated and audible. I'm not claiming perfect acquisition. I'm claiming fragmentary acquisition over a very long period by something with enough cognitive architecture to learn from observation. That is not an extraordinary claim. It is a claim about learning capacity and duration of exposure. The extraordinary part is the cognitive architecture, which is the extraordinary part. There is a body of research on the language acquisition of great apes in captivity. Chimpanzees and gorillas learning American Sign Language or symbol-based systems have acquired vocabularies of hundreds of signs. combined them in novel ways, used them referentially. Washo, Koko, Kanzi. They showed linguistic capabilities that were not predicted by earlier models of primate cognition. The argument I'm making is not that what is in the upper Hoh is a great ape. The argument is that if great apes in captivity, without the specific motivation of needing to communicate with humans relevant to their survival, can acquire significant linguistic capability, then something with equivalent or greater cognitive architecture in a natural environment, with decades of high-quality exposure and a real motivation, might acquire a working vocabulary of 25 to 30 English words. 25 to 30 words is not a lot. It is enough. River wrong, cold wrong, elk far, many gone, go far, after, remember, thank, man, stay. That is the entire communicative burden I am carrying, those words, in that order, with that meaning. You do not need a large vocabulary for an urgent communication. You need the right words and the right listener. I was the right listener because of 17 years of baseline. What I want to say to you is that the right listener for your version of this, whatever your version is, might also be built over years of patient presence in one place with one practice of sustained attention. This is a story about 16 years of incremental contact, building from a single sighting in 2003 to a 25-word vocabulary in 2017 to a last night farewell in 2019. 16 years of showing up, staying, being consistent and non-threatening and present in the same place across the same seasons. The entity, or entities, in the upper Hoh did not choose me arbitrarily. They chose me because I was the ranger who kept coming back. Consistent enough to be safe, eventually consistent enough to be worth communication. That is the model I am offering. Not luck. Consistency. I want to go back to the October 2018 pre-dawn exchange and sit with it for a while longer, because I think there is something in it that I have not fully unpacked. I said two individuals, in the old growth above the cabin, communicating with each other. I said the exchange lasted about 8 minutes and was organized like a conversation, back and forth with pauses. I said the two vocalizations had different qualities, different registers, identifiable as distinct. What I did not say is what the experience felt like from where I was sitting, on the step of the patrol cabin in the dark with my coffee, listening. It felt like overhearing. The specific quality of that experience, hearing other people communicate when the communication is not directed at you and is not about you, when you are in the vicinity of something that is going on without your participation or involvement. There is a particular kind of attention you bring to that experience. Not surveillance, not intrusion. The attention of a person who happens to be present at something larger than themselves. I have heard a lot of wildlife communication in 26 years of backcountry patrol. Elk, ravens, wolves. They communicate, some of it complex enough that researchers spend careers on it. What I heard in the pre-dawn of October 2018 was of a different order. Not just vocalization, not just signal exchange. It had the quality of deliberation, of two individuals working through something together, of consultation. I do not know what they were consulting about. I cannot know that. What I know is the quality of it, the texture of an exchange in which both parties are bringing something to the table and working towards something together through language. That is what it felt like from outside it, in the dark, on a patrol cabin step in the upper Hoh. It felt like the most natural thing in the world and the most unexpected thing I had ever heard in the same moment. That is the nature of a shift in understanding, I think. The thing that changes your understanding of the world does not necessarily arrive as dramatic rupture. Sometimes it arrives as a sound in the dark that is too ordinary to be possible, too calm and deliberate to deny, too close to something you recognize as meaningful to dismiss. Two voices in the old growth at dawn, working through something together, planning or reporting or deciding. Not to me, to each other. I was there and they knew I was there and they had their conversation anyway. That is the kind of trust that 16 years of consistent, non-threatening presence builds. Not trust in me specifically, not fondness, not anything as human as either of those. The absence of concealment, the willingness to be in my hearing without adjusting their behavior to account for my presence. I had been around long enough that I was part of the environment rather than a disruption of it. That might be the most significant thing about the whole 16 years. Not the conversation they had with me. The conversation they had with each other, in my presence, without changing it for my benefit. The 2018 pre-dawn exchange established at minimum 2 individuals. 2 is a minimum. It tells you nothing about the actual population. The October 2017 communication used many across the ridges, many, going far. The direction indicated by the gestures that accompanied it suggested a distribution across a landscape that extends beyond the park boundary. Beyond the corridor, I walked. Beyond the upper Hoh. If that is accurate, then what is in the upper Hoh is a subset of something larger, a population distributed in drainages I have not walked and most people have never walked, moving across a landscape that does not recognize park boundaries, affected by the same pressures affecting every other element of that ecosystem. The Olympic Peninsula is, in a meaningful ecological sense, an island, isolated on 3 sides by water and on the 4th by lower terrain. The mountains have been evolving what lives in them in relative isolation for a long time. The Roosevelt elk here are larger on average than elk elsewhere, shaped by the specific ecology of this place. An island ecosystem produces island effects. Things become specific to the place over time. I do not know what the entity or entities in the upper Hoh are in taxonomic terms. I do not have the evidence to say. I have morphological observations, track data, 1 piece of bark with marks on it, and 16 years of behavioral observation in field notebooks. That is a foundation for a scientific paper, not the paper itself. Patricia Osei and I are going to build the scientific paper, carefully, slowly. The way good field science gets built, 1 documented observation at a time. What we publish, if we publish, will be conservative, hedged, qualified at every step. We will not claim more than we can demonstrate. What I am doing here is different from what we will do in print. Here I can say what I know from experience rather than what I can demonstrate from data. The health of the place is bad and getting worse. The glacier is smaller, the river is lower, the elk are fewer. The something that was in the high country is going far. That is the report. That is what I was asked to carry out. In September of this year, 2025, I drove up the Hoh River Road to the trailhead. I sat in the truck in the gravel lot and looked at the trail register box and thought about signing in. I did not sign in. I sat there for about 40 minutes with the engine off and the windows down and listened to the river and the September birds. Then I drove back to Sequim. I am not ready to go back into the upper drainage. The last time I walked out, I had been asked to stay and to remember, and staying means staying here, in the world of people, in the world where the words can travel. The word remember has a direction to it. The direction is not up the trail toward the upper Hoh. The direction is out into the world, where the many are, and where the information about what is happening in places like this has to travel if it is going to do any good. I am the direction of remember. You, watching this, are the direction of remember. What you do with what I have just told you is your own business, and I am not going to tell you what that is. But the act of listening to it, of sitting with the story of a park ranger, and 16 years of patient attention, and a vocabulary of 25 words, and a jar of stones on a windowsill, that act is part of the carrying out. Stories travel, information travels. The thing that was asked of me was not to solve the problem. It was to name it, to say aloud, something was here. Something has been here for a long time. Something is going now. Because what people are doing to the air and the water and the temperature is changing this place in ways that were predicted decades ago and are happening now. The glacier is losing mass every year. The river is lower, the elk are fewer. And something that lives at the intersection of all those things, something that depends on the cold and the water and the elk and the intact old growth in ways that are specific and necessary and real, is under the same pressure and is responding to it. Going far. After. Stay and remember. I will. I have said it out loud. I have done the carrying out. Whatever comes next is what comes next. Thank you for being here for it. There is something about what happens in the upper Hoh in the hour before dark on a clear fall evening that I keep coming back to. The Sitka spruce in the lower sections of the drainage have deeply ridged bark that catches late light in a way the moss covering does not. When the sun is low and west, coming through the gaps in the canopy at a flat angle, those ridged trunks glow. A deep amber that is the specific color of very old bark in very old light. A forest that looks lit from inside. I was in that light on the last afternoon of every fall patrol I ever did. And every time, in the lower old growth between miles 3 and 6, the same feeling of being inside a space that had been doing what it was doing for a very long time, and that did not particularly require my observation of it to continue. That is the feeling I am asking you to sit with when you think about the upper Hoh. Not the encounter, not the exchange, not the stones and the tracks. The feeling of being in a space that is ancient in a way that your life is not. The encounter was inside that. The 16 years were inside that. The thing that was there was also inside that. Old in the place the way the trees are old in the place. That is what going far means. That is what wrong means. That is what remember means. The amber light will still be there. The bark will still glow. The river will still be going. But the thing that was in the high country, in the drainages above the trail, moving through the old growth in a way that left tracks in snowpack and structures in hollows and stones on cabin steps, will be somewhere else. Far. After. I am still here. I am telling you. That is what I was asked to do, and that is what I am doing. Go to the Hoh if you can. Walk the Hall of Mosses. Walk as far up the trail as you have time and fitness for. Take note of the quality of the light and the sound of the river and the smell of the forest floor. Walk attentively, not looking at your phone, not in a hurry to get to the next viewpoint or photograph. Just walking, looking, being in the place rather than consuming it. You might not see anything anomalous. In all likelihood, you will not. The upper drainage is 18 miles from the trailhead and requires a permit to camp in, and whatever was there has told me it is going. But the practice of going to a place and attending to it carefully, without a predetermined story of what you are going to find, is its own kind of staying. Stay. The first word. The park will be there. The old growth will be there. The river will be there, lower in September than it was, but there. The glacier will be smaller, but it will still be there, still feeding the headwaters, still the source of the water that makes the Hoh what it is. Be in it while it is still what it is. That is also a form of remembering. That is my last thing.